Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's presentation, Democracies in Danger. Tonight's talk is sponsored by the Peter F. Cowie Center on Global Transformation, the Pacific Leadership's Fellows Program, based here at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, the center for which I'm a director. It's also proudly co-sponsored by the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies here at GPS, chaired or directed by Rafael, sitting right here. Many of you know Rafael. We want to thank all of you for being here. We want to thank many people for their continued generosity to allow these kinds of events to occur. We are particularly grateful to Joan and Erwin Jacobs, who have been long-standing benefactors to the center and to the university at large. As a matter of housekeeping, I just want to suggest that, or implore you all to save your questions till the end. We're going to have a fixed allotment of time for talk, and then we're going to have a Q&A session at the end where you can ask Heraldo questions, and Rafael will join him on the stage here, and we'll have hopefully a very interesting dialogue. I'm going to try to keep this brief, but Heraldo has not made this easy because he's done many, many things in his career, so I'm going to give you the highlight reel, and it's still going to be long. Heraldo Muñoz served as the Chilean Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2014 to 2018. He previously served as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, as well as Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean for the United Nations Development Program, where he led hundreds of professionals to tackle democratic governance, poverty reduction, environmental sustainability, and conflict prevention and recovery. Muñoz served as Ambassador Permanent Representative of Chile to the United Nations from 2003 to 2010. He was chair of the UN Peacebuilding Commission, facilitator of the UN Security Council reform consultations, and president of the UN Security Council in 2004. Furthermore, from February 2009 to April 2010, he served as chair of the Commission of Inquiry into the assassination of former Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. Muñoz holds a PhD in International Studies from the Korbel School of International Studies in Denver. He also holds a diploma in International Relations from Católica in Santiago, Chile, and a BA in Political Science from the State University of New York at Oswego. And as of, I think, hot off the press, as of today, was announced the man in charge of monitoring elections in Mexico. So another feather to put in his cap. Please join me in welcoming PLF Muñoz to the podium. We're very, very lucky to have him here, and you really are in store for a treat. So, Heraldo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Rafael, for inviting me to the University of California at San Diego. I recall the last time I was here, which was quite a while ago, in 1988, early 1988, when I was preparing to play a role in the plebiscite against the Pinochet dictatorship to mobilize the no vote against his continuation in the dictatorial regime that he led. And as a breather, I was invited to be a professor at USC by a good friend of many of us here, Abe Lowenthal. And I taught a course, and I wrote a piece for the LA Times on the conjuncture that Chile was facing with the plebiscite and arguing in favor. And somebody read it here, and they invited me to come over. And that was the last time I was here. Took the train from Los Angeles and back, and I had a very stimulating debate with professors and students about what should be done. There were many who doubted that we could defeat a dictator, but we did. So my talk today has a lot of reminiscences from that time, and I speak about democracies in danger because of my own personal experience. I lived through the coup. I lived the repression. I was briefly in jail. And I dedicated 17 and a half years of my life to fight against that dictatorship. And we won. So the responsibility of preserving the democracy that we regain, it is particularly significant for my generation of Chileans who experienced the collapse of democracy, one of the most buoyant democracies in Latin America, and then the recuperation of that democracy, the transition to a fully democratic regime, which took quite a while. And it still is an ongoing process because democracy, as I will say, is quite new in Latin America, and it's quite imperfect. But let me go into the subject because I would argue that democracy is under attack, not only in Latin America, but in many corners of the world. This is not something new, but what is new is that the enemies of democracy have more sophisticated and more powerful weapons to undermine democracies in various fashions. Populism in different varieties has spread along many continents, and authoritarian leaders have increased their attacks on democracy, evading the norms and the institutions of democracy and fundamental rights, of course. And they support each other in that process. And add to that the travails of globalization, of social and economic inequality, the economic crisis, all of that increases the anger, the frustration, and the discontent of many people, and those are breeding grounds for these populists and saviors of the fatherland that come up. So let me just begin by saying, well, what democracy are we talking about? And I'm not going to get into a long theoretical debate on democracy, but suffice it to say that democracy for me is an ideal of forms. And as such is formalist. Because it is responsible for establishing the forms, the molds, and the minimal rational structures so that people can be simultaneously free and obedient and simultaneously concordant and discordant. So I sort of abide to the minimalist definition of democracy by Joseph Schumpeter, and more recently by a political scientist who's very keen on this, Adam Prussorgsky, who sort of rejects a more demanding definition of democracy to materialize certain values, which I find, of course, I agree with that, but I think it's better the minimalist interpretation of democracy as a political arrangement through which people select governments through elections that are competitive and have a reasonable possibility of removing incumbent governments. And of course, the idea is that they leave if they lose. So that is what I think democracy should be understood as. So what is the analysis that there is on the state of democracy in the world? Unfortunately, it's quite grim. And that's why I say that democracy is under attack. A very solid report that the global state of democracy by International IDEA, which is an institution that dedicates itself to following democracy, promoting it, states that for the 5th consecutive year, the number of countries in 2022 that are on the authoritarian course exceed the number of countries that follow a democratic direction by almost 3 times. The study estimates that 70% of the world population now live under non-democratic regimes or in countries in democratic decline. And only 9% of the global population live in high-performance democracies. This is quite worrying. In fact, most people in the world have never lived in a democracy. And the Economist Intelligence Unit report on Democratic Index for 2022, as the last one, shows that there's been a stagnation of democracy worldwide. According to that index, only 72 of 167 countries and territories measured could be considered democracies, whether full or even defective. So only 43.1% of the total evaluated can be considered democracies. And well, this is a very terrible result because this is an evaluation made after the COVID pandemic, which had meant the severe limitation of freedom as a consequence of what occurred. And Latin America recorded its 7th year of decline in democracy since 2015. So the region reflected the largest recession in democracy among all the continents measured. So this is sort of the analysis of what a brief picture of what is going on at the world level. So what are the causes of democratic decline? And let me focus more on Latin America. I think the decline of democracy interacts or is conditioned by several factors. One of them is corruption. Enduring corruption, what does is erodes trust in institutions, erodes trust in government. And unfortunately, the last report of Transparency International warns that efforts to combat corruption have stalled. And Latin America, in this case, is one of the most endemic cases of corruption. Let me just mention Ecuador. One of the presidential candidates who ran on a platform of anti-corruption in the last presidential election was assassinated because his platform was anti-corruption and anti-crime. And he was assassinated, and 6 individuals were arrested, and it was claimed that they perpetrated the assassination. Those 6 individuals were in turn assassinated in jail, and that presidential career ended up with all candidates wearing bulletproof vests in their final closing campaign activities. So corruption is evidently in combining with violence in the case of Ecuador in a major way. That is a country that is facing a let me just try to turn off my phone because being named today in the morning has produced a lot of phone calls. So this is a major issue, a major explanation of why democracy continues to be in decline in the region. And the next issue is insecurity and crime, caused largely by the expansion of transnational crime in the region. And polls show that citizen support for democracy generally fluctuate according to the ups and downs of the economy. If you look at opinion polls, when the economy is expanding, there's more support for democracy and vice versa. But now, increasingly, support for democracy is being conditioned by the perceptions of security or insecurity and violent crime. And violent crime is expanding. Now there's no Latin American country that is free from transnational crime. It used to be the Mexican cartels, but now it's the cartels in Colombia, the Venezuelan Tren de Aragua, the Brazilian also cartels that have expanded. And not only that, not only have they expanded, but in addition to that, they are not limited to drug trafficking. No, now it's extortions, now it's kidnappings, now it is trafficking of human beings, of course, laundering money, etc. So they've expanded into other illicit economies because, among other things, since the price of some drugs have declined, they've gone into other illicit economies. And the best measure of how people are worried about their institutions is the rate of homicides. The rate of homicide has skyrocketed in Latin America. I'm not talking about Mexico. I'm not talking about Venezuela. I'm not talking about Brazil, which we are, of course, but I'm talking about Chile, who used to have 10 years ago a rate of assassinations of 2.5 per 100,000 population, which is the best measure to measure homicides. And it's the clearest measure of violence. Now it is 6.5. It's gone from 2.5 to 6.5. Uruguay used to be about the same. Now it is 10.5. And Costa Rica, another low-crime country, used to be also very low. Now it is 14 and above 14. So assassinations have expanded throughout the region. And this is why then you can understand the Nayib Bukele phenomenon in El Salvador, where he comes in and says, well, I will end up homicides, and I will put the Mara Salvatrucha and the other ones, I will put all the members of gangs in jail, and we will end up homicides and crime. But in exchange of that, you have to give up some freedoms. And the press is not going to be free, and I'm going to be, as he said, the coolest dictator in the world, as he said, and he re-elected himself in clear violation of the El Salvadorian constitution. But since he built a mega jail and put all the gang members and the suspected gang members, because you're a young person in a poblacion in El Salvador, possibly you're young and poor, and if you have a tattoo, forget it, you're going to be in that mega jail. And the due process of law, you can also forget about it. But homicides, that used to be about 45, 46 per 100,000 population in El Salvador, now are like a European country. And people then are satisfied. I don't know if they're happy, they're satisfied. They can go out at night without being killed, robbed, or suffer violence. That's why he had the support of over 80% of the population for his re-election. So what does it say about democracy, that? My reaction is that democracies have to be able to give security and tranquility to people, because security is a human right. It's a basic human right. And unfortunately, progressive sectors and the left in Latin America have felt that the issue of security is a matter for the right, when it's an essential human right. So if democracies cannot protect themselves with comprehensive approaches to violence and crime, prevention, working with local social leaders, with capacity building, and particularly capacity for young people that do not go to school or work, so that they don't become soldiers of the drug traffickers. There are baskets of measures that you can have to attack crime and violence. But we should not give up on ensuring security with democracy. Today, unfortunately, Bukele is the most popular president in Latin America. You go anywhere, and yes, in all opinion polls, he ranks first. And that tells you then what people are thinking about democracy and what they're thinking about their institutions and their own safety. Third, governance has become more complicated in our times because of economic hardship, because of globalization, because of the impact of interstate conflicts like the Russian invasion of Ukraine that increases the prices of foodstuffs. All of that makes it so that governance today is more difficult. To govern is more difficult. The erosion of the traditional middle class, the emergence of identity groups that demand recognition to their own issues, the pandemics, the forced migration, all of that makes it then more difficult to govern. And that is something that we should take into account. That has an effect, for example, on the crisis of traditional political parties. A phenomenon that extends throughout Latin America, the decline of the traditional parties that also happened, by the way, in France and Italy. The main political parties there disappeared. Christian democracy, to give an example. And the fragmentation and dispersion of the party system, the proliferation of numerous political forces and micro parties, the specter of populism as a consequence. In Peru, there's 23 political parties. Very difficult to govern when you have 23 political parties and, well, you have a president that doesn't control Congress in addition, and, well, it's a long story in Peru. But there are some parties called vientres de alquiler, which means that they are parties created only so that somebody can be a candidate, and if you don't like it, whether you're elected or not, well, you can move on to another party. Unless you have reform to avoid that and avoid the dispersion of the political system, then governing will be a lot more difficult in difficult times. So the crisis of the political party system is one of the components of the problems of governance in the region. Now, of course, there's an enduring problem, which is social and economic inequality. The haves and the have-nots in the region are characteristic. Unfortunately, Latin America is one of the most unequal regions of the world. The most egalitarian country in Latin America, measured by the income, the Gini coefficient that measures income, is Uruguay. That's the most egalitarian country. But Uruguay is more unequal than the most unequal country of the European Union, which is Portugal. So you can imagine, the most egalitarian is more unequal than the most unequal of the European Union. That sort of tells you a little bit about, how citizens regard their own countries. Well, if there's so much inequality, why should I trust politicians? Why should I trust institutions? Why wouldn't I vote anti-system? Or why wouldn't I vote, simply, even though it might be a requirement to vote? And that is what is happening in a lot of places in our region. And so what are the expressions of the decline of democracy? Well, unlike the past, it's not coup d'etats or cuartelazos, where the military, attacked the presidential palace, what we saw always in the movie and characterized Latin America. That was part of Latin America, Well, that was characteristic of a period of the Cold War. That's no longer the case. coup d'etats practically don't occur in Latin America anymore. What is occurring is a hijacking of democracy from within, what I call the kidnapping of democracy from those that utilize the mechanisms of democracy to subvert it. So in Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega was originally elected more or less democratically. And then he ended up having people shot in the streets, jailing his companion commandantes of the Sandinista army, and having gradually a dictatorial regime. Hugo Chavez was also elected democratically initially, and gradually, when accumulating all the power of the legislative, when the opposition won the assembly and the judiciary. So that's what is going on in the region. In a gradual fashion, sometimes you don't even realize that there are laws that are passed that begin to erode democracy. You don't realize that some heads of state attack the press or pass laws because they control Congress to limit freedom of expression or freedom of assembly, or the independent institutions, electoral institutions, for example. So that is happening in a lot of countries. The attacks against the press occur in many countries of the region, so that even what I say full democracies show a decline in the quality of our democracies. So truly, in order to understand what is going on in the region, you cannot have two categories, that dictatorship versus democracy. It has to be a little bit more nuanced, and that's why there are hybrid regimes in between. They are not full democracy, they are not dictatorships. It's governments that often are on the road to authoritarianism, but if you're on the road to authoritarianism, you're not there yet. And there's a possibility to rescue those countries. And what do these regimes utilize? Aside from this gradual, almost sometimes you don't even perceive. It's like the anecdote of the frog in the slowly boiling water. You don't realize. Well, one of the expressions of the weapons is lawfare. Lawfare, which is a combination in English of law and warfare, is a utilization of judicial instruments to attack your opposition. And that has happened in Brazil, when former judge and then Minister Moro put Inácio Lula da Silva in jail, or when Dilma Rousseff was removed in Brazil, or when President Añez of Bolivia was jailed, and she's still in jail, by the way. Or even when Gustavo Petro was also attacked from a judicial standpoint before he became president. So this weapons of the judiciary is one of the expressions of how these regimes are going towards in the road to authoritarianism. And here the point is, democracy requires not only legitimacy in the access to power, but also legitimacy in the exercise of that power. So it's not enough that you were more or less elected. You have to exercise power in a democratic fashion. And that is a key point in my view. In other words, we're talking about not only legitimacy of results from an election, but legitimacy of procedures. And a lot of polls demonstrate that people in the region are not so angered about the way somebody was elected, maybe not very democratically, but they are really angry about the way democracy functions. And that I think we have to keep in mind. So let me just finish by a couple of observations about how the international arena also has an impact. I must say that Donald Trump's demonstration effect in Latin America has been extremely negative. The violent invasion in the US Capitol was almost mimicked by Jair Bolsonaro when he lost the election to Lula by a small margin. And the attacks against the presidential palace, the judiciary, and the legislative branch was almost exactly the same model. If Trump hadn't happened, I don't think that the phenomenon of Bolsonaro could have happened, in my view. And there are other followers. And a study on electoral integrity at a global level placed the US in 15th place among 29 countries in the Americas. 15th place. And as the lowest in the ranking of all liberal democracies in the world, due to various